So thank you very much for being with us. Today we are going to be having a discussion on pesticides. And we are in what we call Pesticides Awareness Week. And I have with me members of the Pesticides Control Board. I have on my immediate right Mr. Melvin James, who was former chair of the Pesticides Control Board. Then I have next Mr. Hiram Williams, who is a member of the Pesticides Control Board, and Mr. Keithley Amory, who is also a member of the Pesticides Control Board. A pleasant afternoon to all three of you.
Good afternoon, and thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Right. Pesticides, of course, are something that we all use. And we use them to get rid of pests.
True.
You know, whether it is, in our households, whether it is on our farms where we grow our crops and so on. They are important to us in many ways, but at the very same time, we have to be aware that they can also be detrimental to animal health and human health. So I would ask Mr. Williams to tell us what is the theme for this Pesticides Awareness Week and what the theme actually means.
Good day to everyone, and thank you, Mr. Williams. Normally, around this time of the year, we observe Pesticides Awareness Week. Unfortunately, we had to restrict, curtail the activities we normally would have associated with a week of activities. However, we are happy to be here on this program to share a bit of information on pesticides. The team which has been adopted, and it's a regional team, choose, use alternatives to toxic household, agricultural, and public health pesticides for a better life and environment. Our actions are our future. Pesticides are they're extensively used worldwide to manage agricultural pests. They will kill and repel unwanted pests, but also cause many human deaths each year. Today we will discuss the widespread use of pesticides in agriculture and look at the benefits and problems associated with these helpful but dangerous chemicals. And in keeping with the theme, we'll discuss alternatives to highly hazardous toxic chemicals. We can't overemphasize the importance of agriculture, as it was developed to produce crops and livestock for human consumption. However, there are other organisms out there that want to consume the same crops, and they do consume and destroy a significant percentage of crops that are intended for human consumption. As a result, it affects food production, and certainly it affects farmers in terms of their economic survival. In order to prevent high loss in food production, pesticides are often used to try to combat the problem. They are quite effective in reducing and managing the pest population, but as I said before, they can be extremely dangerous to human health and the environment. And so I would pause here, but we are happy to have that team which stress that we need to do something about the dangerous chemicals that are being used. We need to reduce them and, as far as possible, find alternatives that would be just as effective.
Right. Now, Mr. James, you have been the chairperson for the Pesticides Control Board. Now, what is the makeup of the board in terms of the people on the board and the objectives, basically, of the Pesticides Control Board?
Thank you so much, Mr. Williams, and welcome to all listeners and viewers. I trust that our discourse today will really bring a lot of enlightenment and that we will have greater consciousness, greater interaction, and even greater results. Until recently, I was the chair. The board consists of representation from public health, the Bureau of Standards, because you know there's a testing facility there. We have private enterprises involved in pest management. We also look at agricultural input, so that is also represented on the board. We also have representation from NEVIS, and we also look at the Ministry of Environment. So the board tried to be very comprehensive in terms of the users and the regulators of pesticides. Because of that, customs is also included, because just about all of the pesticides have to be imported. So customs play a very significant role. So we have this body, and apart from the general body that I just mentioned, there's a subgrouping that spends time looking at applications, reviewing applications for chemicals, pesticides in particular, to determine whether it's something that we should take off the shelf or whether it's something that we could allow in the country. Because as new information come up, then you might realize that there's something that you're using which is deleterious, and you need to look at it. For example, there is something that we generally call the black mosquito coil. It is in use in some countries in the Caribbean. But when we studied it, we found that the deleterious effects, its association with cancer, the likelihood was higher than normal, and that we wouldn't want to go that route. Even right now, there's a lot of discussion about chemicals like glyphosate, and these are things that the board reviews. So that what the board tried to do is to make sure that the present conventional chemicals that are in circulation are not known to be very negatively impacting. And any new ones which we allow in should be even safer. So that is the role, and you know, every year we try to come to the public to make our presence felt and to be able to interact so that we could give greater clarity, also receive suggestions and word from them so that, you know, all in all, we have a safer country and community.
Mm-hmm. Now, Mr. Amory, it has been estimated that globally $38 billion are spent on pesticides annually. And manufacturers and researchers are designing new formulations of pesticides to meet the global demand. Pesticides, as we know, are toxic to the target organisms. However, they can be toxic to human beings as well. What would you say to farmers and persons who use pesticides in terms of how they can minimize the risk to their health?
Okay, first of all, good afternoon once again, and I'm quite happy to be here to pass on some information pertaining to the use of pesticides, and as a question being directed to me, even the abuse of pesticides. And I do hope that the responses that we give today will benefit farmers and householders alike. Now, you're quite right, there's a lot of money. It's a billion-dollar industry, and everybody is working diligently towards trying to encourage food safety, food security, food safety, etc. But in doing that, it also poses a risk to our health. And in terms of farmers who are actually the forerunners by using these chemicals, they are at major risk of getting their health compromised. We have seen, as Mr. James pointed out, that health risks such as cancer, Alzheimer's disease, infertility, rashes, respiratory diseases can develop from the use of these pesticides. In addition to that, if farmers don't use pesticides according to the label direction, we can have air pollution, water contamination, as well as soil contamination. However, in order to minimize the risk to farmers, we have been encouraging the Pesticide Board and all persons who manufacture these chemicals. On that label, they do specify the use of protective equipment. We call it PPE, we'll say PPE, which is the personal protective equipment. And they do explain to you up front that you must wear these protective equipment. That comprises of wearing long sleeve shirts, long pants, rubber boots that are chemically resistant, rubber gloves that are chemically resistant, mask, respiratory masks that are geared towards chemicals. Because some masks, persons will say any mask can do, but these masks are actually designed to deter chemicals from entering. Sometimes they are full face masks that, depending on the chemical that is being used, that they have to put on those things. So it is very important that farmers adhere to the use of these protective equipment. And in addition, they must also wear them properly. Because sometimes, persons will say, okay, you can just get a normal rubber glove, but that is not the proper one because chemicals can still leach to them. And the way they're handling the chemicals, spills and everything like that can even get into. So there's a proper method of dressing when they are utilizing this equipment. So it's very, very important that to minimize any risk associated with the use of chemicals, that farmers adhere to the wear this protective equipment and to always utilize this protective equipment. And it's very, very important that they do read the label to see what kind of dangers that they can be exposed to.
Right. Now, some time ago, about a few years ago, attention was drawn to the French islands in the Caribbean, particularly Martinique and Guadeloupe. And of course, a pesticide called chlordicone that was sprayed on banana crops. And what they discovered is that a number of persons in those French territories were coming down with cancer. And they were able to trace it and link it to the chlordicone that was used to spray the banana crops. So that is as serious as it is. I know here, for example, in St. Kitts, I have seen, I don't know if you used to use it on the sugar estates, the sugar cane. They will go about and they will be spraying, of course. Was it gramoxone? What is it that they used?
Well, there are various chemicals that the sugar industry utilize, especially for weed control.
Mm-hmm.
But I do know in the banana crops that years ago we used to use a chemical called, it's an insecticide, Furadan, and there was also an nematicide called Mocap that in the final analysis, after we looked at it closer, that it had to be, the use had to be curtailed because it was very, very dangerous. So when we find these things, because as I said, we do not manufacture, and as Mr. James pointed out, with the technical arm of the pesticide board, when we are looking back at the review of these chemicals and we go into the international arena and to find out exactly what's going on in the outer world, we now take stock of what chemicals we are using here on the island. And when we find that, we then revisit what we are using. And once we find, okay, listen, this is causing a threat, pose a serious threat to our people, we curtail the use of it and look for alternatives.
Right.
So that is something very important that the pesticide, the toxic chemical board look at. So those chemicals that were already in use, presently we are revisiting them. Malathion was one of the chemicals that is being used all the time. It was very effective against insects. But then, true, we are signatories to a number of conventions, and they will send out information that, okay, they are looking at these chemicals. Then we too now have to start to look at what we have on our list and revisit them. So it's very important that these conventions, we look at them, and once they send that information back to us, they are revisited. And once we find that they do pose that danger, because they have all the technology, testing equipment, we pull them from the shelves and find alternatives. So it's very, very important that, some persons say, oh, this chemical was very effective. Yes, it was. But as the Pesticide and Toxic Chemical Board, we too have a role to play in ensuring that you are safe, our food is safe, and the environment is safe. So once that is done, we take them off the shelf and try and find alternatives.
Right. So the whole issue is that one has to find a balance, because on one hand, the pesticides is very toxic and can kill, the pests. But on the other hand, it is detrimental to human health and detrimental to the environment. So therefore, you have to find the balance on one hand on how do you kill the pests without really adversely affecting human health and the environment.
That's true.
And to go back to the chlordicone that was sprayed on banana crops in Martinique and Guadeloupe, what they discovered is that it is an endocrine disruptor, meaning that it can affect the hormonal system. What happened is that it resulted in premature births and adverse brain development in children and things like that. So we are talking here in terms of food consumption, because somehow you mentioned earlier that the pesticides can get into the water.
Yes.
The water table, of course, it gets into the earth and then it gets into the water. And then being on food as well, and we consume that food, then we can be adversely affected.
Definitely.
Because fruits and vegetables are sprayed, for example.
Definitely. That is true, and that is why we are very concerned. And the technical arm of the pesticide board is basically inundated with requests for new chemicals, because as you, in your opening statement, you mentioned that it's a $1 billion industry, and a number of new chemicals basically coming out, new trade names, and they have to be evaluated. So the problem is that many persons tend to go on their computer and they say, oh, I like to see what this chemical is saying that it can do X and Y. And then sometimes they just go and try and order it one time without any consultation. And then when it comes here, then there's where the problem starts. As Mr. James mentioned, customs is on the board. And once they reach in there to customs and the hold is put on it, they're saying that the board is holding up their productivity, etc. But the board have to evaluate that chemical prior to releasing it into the Federation. So it's very important, because those same effects, health effects that you're talking about, we want to prevent them from happening in this country.
Yes,
just on the,
sure, Mr. Williams.
yeah, just on the, because you brought up the chlordicone, and St. Kitts and Nevis is signatory to the Stockholm Convention. And that convention is an international global treaty to protect human health and the environment from chemicals that remain intact in the environment for long periods. One of the chemicals, which is a pesticide, is chlordicone, is listed as a banned substance. So in effect, all countries, including St. Kitts and Nevis, is obligated to ban such chemical. So that chemical would not be permitted in St. Kitts, as is all the chemicals included, and not only pesticides, but the other industrial chemicals that are actually listed because of their effect on human health and the environment.
Right, so we want pesticides that, will carry out what they're supposed to carry out, but at the same time, they must be eco-friendly, and that they must be somehow biodegradable. I know that in killing insects and killing pests and all that sort of a thing, sometimes the other effect is that it kills the very good microorganisms that are in the earth as well, and that are necessary.
That's true.
For the fertility of the land and so on.
Yes, Lesroy, the concept of the chemical, what we call the chemical fertilizer, yes, we do recognize that the earlier groups, they were very deleterious to human health. You mentioned how that they have been known to affect your reproductive system, the endocrine system, the nervous system. Those are some of the ways in which they bind with different substances in the body to cause ill effects, right? And there's a whole set of research going on. One set is about chemical substances which are less deleterious. But later on, as we go in the program, we're also going to look at options which take us totally away from chemicals. Because try as much as you may, what I am noticing is that over time, chemicals which are presently listed now as safe and good, you find that after a while, some of the ill effects begin to be known. I'll give you one example. We know that from long time, DDT, Furidan and those things were well known to be very toxic. And through the conventions, they were able to reduce their use and eventually pull them off the shelf. And things like imidacloprid and diazonan, those things were recommended as replacements. 30, 50 years after, we're now finding that the said imidacloprid is not as harmless as it was rated many years ago. It's now known to affect wildlife like bees. It is known to be more persistent than we thought. In other words, it doesn't biodegrade, it doesn't break down as easily as we thought. Now, people are doing tests in foods, and you're finding residues there. Even after processing, like for example, you take cornflakes, and you would have thought that going through the mill and all the heating and all things like that, that those things would have been leached out or dissolved out or through some chemical reaction neutralized. Instead of that, these things are still found there. So that apart from the major effects which, for example, Mr. Amory spoke about, where you have cancers, where you have vomiting and that kind of thing, you can still get small quantities of these chemicals. And over time, they build up. And that, the food chain concept, that eventually they'll be stored in certain cells in the body or in microorganisms, and we consume them, and then the level eventually becomes higher than the body can deal with, and then we have ill effects. So it is very, very critical, and here we are trying to present all of the different views for our viewers and our listeners.
Right, and I go back to Claudicone. Claudicone, because there was a show done on the BBC, and the name of it really was The Poisoning of Paradise.
Wow.
Speaking in terms of what took place, you know, in those French territories in Martinique and Guadeloupe, and why was this allowed to happen? Why was there not more information given to the people in terms of the use of this pesticide that has been so detrimental to the health of the people of Martinique and Guadeloupe? That many of them now, they realize the men coming down with prostate cancer and things like that, which means that the claudicone is highly carcinogenic, cancer-causing.
Yes, while I may not have the specifics in that particular matter, there are several possible options. Sometimes we have dumping, not only in food, but you can have them in other products, where some countries, while they don't use a product that they make, they would allow it to be exported if another country is willing to accept it. That's one. Again, sometimes the facts are known afterwards, you know. That is also another option. But there's a treaty which speaks about prior informed consent, meaning that before country accept a pesticide, they must be clearly aware of what they're getting, all of the facts about it, so that when you get something, you know what you're getting. You're not blindsided. And we too are signatories there, so that it helps us in reducing the amount of research you have to do on something, so that you know the qualities about it, and then you must consciously decide if it's safe for you. You spoke about the situation in Martinique and Guadeloupe. That is one of several. I don't clearly recall, but I think it was in St. Croix that there was a situation with methyl bromide where there was some accidental release, and some persons, residents sleeping in their homes, some of them inhaled too much, and some of them died. Even here, elsewhere in the Caribbean, St. Kitts. I remember at least one case where there was a deliberate ingestion of gramoxone, and the person lost their life. And so, yes, in the acute state, it can be very harmful. But let's not just focus on human beings. Globally, the number of bees have gone down significantly, and bees are very important to us. A lot of our fruits and vegetables must first be pollinated by the bees before we can have them. So once we're looking for increased food, then we have to be thinking about our bees numbers. Bees, you know, direct products like honey and beeswax and that kind of thing. But the number of bees in the world has plummeted, and there's several speculatory causes. One of which is that the abundance of pesticide may have caused their poisoning. So it's not just humans. Then we can look at the environment, even the marine environment. Sometimes we have a lot of fishes and marine life that are deformed or even dying. And when these things are checked out, when analyses are done, pesticides have a role in these things. So in truth and in fact, it's far and wide and very expansive.
Mm-hmm. Now, you mentioned something, Mr. James, and I don't know if Mr. Williams can pick up on it, is that pesticides, they stay in soil for decades and possibly centuries because they are not biodegradable and so on. And the effects of these pesticides, if this is the case, can be very long-term.
Correct. And this is why it's important for St. Kitts and Nevis, along with many countries, to sign on some of these conventions. I mentioned already the Stockholm Convention, and Mr. James was just speaking about Prime Farm Consent, which is the Rotterdam Convention. Apart from even pesticides, they look at also other toxic chemicals. And the idea is to get countries to be committed and obligated to reducing, under the Stockholm Convention, reducing and as far as possible eliminating the use of these hazardous chemicals. Whereas in the Rotterdam Convention, there are some chemicals that are still in use, but it's important that the countries are aware of what are the risks associated with their use. So before they enter into the country, the exporting country must inform the countries. And you're correct also that these chemicals are persistent in terms of the amount of time they hang around in their environment. In some cases, they bioaccumulate and biomagnify, in the sense that they build up, as Mr. James was indicating also, they build up in the body, but the body doesn't have the mechanism to remove them. So they just keep building up until they come to a level where they are cancerous and compromise your immune system. Our job as one of our functions as the board, we evaluate products that are intended for use in St. Kitts and Nevis. We have access to the scientific reviews, which we can review for ourselves and make a determination as to whether that product is suitable for use in St. Kitts and Nevis. And later on in the product, I would probably go through the process that we use in determining whether a product is fit for use in St. Kitts and Nevis. And it is a long process, not only long, but very extensive, to make sure that we are satisfied that we can use it here and it does not have significant effect on human, animals, and also the environment.
Right. I know we are going to move towards, for example, alternatives and, pesticides that are a lot more eco-friendly and biodegradable and more, if I can say, friendly towards one's health and so on. But, we use a lot of chemicals, pesticides, for example, Baygon and BOP and, things like that we use in the household to get rid of mosquitoes and flies and ants and termites and all of that sort of a thing. And I am always very conscious whenever I spray BOP. You close up the windows because you want the maximum effect to kill the bug that is in the house, the insects that are in the house. But then you do not stay in there. You leave.
Yeah, you should not. Yeah,
and then you should not stay inside. You leave the house and then you come back after maybe 20, 30 minutes. And that is something I know, and that is something that I do because I'm very much aware that inhaling these pesticides is very hazardous to one's health. Now, Mr. Amory, could you comment a bit on persistent organic pollutants?
Yeah,
the sources and the effects and the solutions.
the persistent organic pollutants, those are actually very hazardous chemicals that they're in the schedule of the pesticide toxic chemical thing that we are looking at. As a matter of fact, those are one of the things that we are trying to phase out. I will say that these chemicals that we're looking at have some fancy names that it's these highly hazardous chemicals, that we have here. It's lindane and all of those chemicals. One have to be very careful when we are, anytime there's a chemical that will be coming in and we say it's an organophosphate, we try to put a block on it immediately. From the time we see organophosphates, carbamates, as a matter of fact, the Taiwanese, they gave us beautiful lab here in St. Kitts and Nevis, and one of the main chemicals, or two of the main chemicals that they're being focusing on is the carbamates, which, as Mr. James say, is 7 is one of the quote and unquote safest chemicals that we used to use years ago. Until now that we found out that it can cause a problem and leave its residue. So the Taiwanese, has now given us a lab to test for those residues on our fruits and vegetables. The same thing for organophosphates. So we have to be very, very careful, and that is why we are asking farmers to, desist from using these chemicals and to look for alternatives. But we do have some persons who say, okay, they are very effective, and we encourage them, okay, you're using them. Use them according to the label. Wash the food and vegetables before you carry them to the marketplace such that you can reduce the levels that may be in residues. So the lab is here that we are encouraging persons to go to, bring your vegetables so when extension officers come that they can utilize them. It's as Mr. Williams said, we have been trying our best to phase out these chemicals.
Yes.
We try not to allow them to come in.
Yes.
From the time we know, okay, somebody wants to say organophosphate, sorry, that's a no-no. And those that we have, as I said, we are revisiting. It's very important for us because, as I said, a lot of these chemicals that used to be used years ago, I was just trying to look for some that carbofew, and that is again is the Furodan that we used to be using years ago. We have already tried and phase out that long time.
Yeah, that's out. That's out.
That's out.
That's out.
I have some of this. Just to add to what Mr. Avery is saying on the
Mocap and
Mocap, yes.
on the persistent organic pollutants. Under the same Stockholm Convention that I mentioned earlier, they have already identified and listed there about 30 such chemicals, which include pesticides and other industrial chemicals. Chlordecone is also one of them, and you had dieldrin. There's Mirex, which is also a pesticide, toxaphene, pesticides, but there's a whole list of them. And because of our obligation, St. Kitts and Nevis, including other countries, to the Stockholm Convention Treaty, we are obligated to, as far as possible, where they have actually on a ban list, we have to do the same here, put them on our ban list. In some cases, there are products that are unintentionally produced, as in the case of when you're manufacturing a product for some reason. But the idea is to minimize their use, minimize their production, and as far as possible, put measures in place that you can eventually eliminate these products. Because, as the name suggests, persistent organic pollutants, they are around for a very long time. It's very difficult to get rid of them. So the idea is not to produce them, don't have them around, eliminate them.
I know that human beings, we have a role to play. For example, even in the household and keeping clean environments, because sometimes you don't keep a clean environment and it attracts certain insects and pests. For example, you keep a dirty environment, you're going to have flies, you're going to have cockroaches, you're going to have rats, you're going to have mice, you're going to have even termites, and so on. And we are told of how we can reduce the congregation of these insects and rodents and so on, that in themselves are harmful to human health. Leptospirosis, that is by rats and cockroaches and other things, they carry diseases. But if we have a proliferation of those things because of unsanitary environments, then of course we have to use more pesticides and so on to get rid of them, and then it's a sort of a double whammy in terms of to our health and our surroundings and so on. So my question is, the household pesticides, what are some of the alternatives to the household pesticides? I've heard things like people say neem, for example, it's a herb, it's a bush, but some people say it is a pesticide.
It's both. Let me volunteer some information about alternatives. You did ask about the household, but if you would allow me, I would like to stretch it a little more widely and speak a little about household and also about agriculture or food. Of course, listening to us, we've said a lot of the reasons why pesticides are bad. But we have them here for a purpose. Mm-hmm. And especially from the food context, one realized that it is the introduction of pesticides, maybe like just under 100 years ago, that helped to revolutionize food production. And going along with that came a spiral, a spike in the global population, to the point where, for the first couple of 100 years, the population was well under like 2 billion. Now, in maybe 150 years, it spiked up to 7 billion and climbing. And so these people we all have to be fed. And so while we are talking about reducing the use of the pesticides, we also have to find a replacement, because it is used a lot for human health, as you just said, and in food. Now, in terms of in the home, like for mosquitoes, you know, there are certain plants, and I didn't get the time to revise the name, but there's some plants that you can put in water, and that would prevent mosquito larvae from developing. Very simple. Clean environment also does a lot in terms of keeping certain insects away. There are hormones, there are attractants, even like sticky traps. If you want to control, one of the ways to help to control flies, you know, you have these sticky things, and the fly adhere to it, it can't get off, right? It's unsightly, but then the more modern ones are things like light, ultraviolet lights, and they're attracted to the light, and then they're sucked in. Once they, you know, there's a vacuum, they're sucked in. So there are things that can be done other than using pesticides. Now, here are a few things I'd like to raise with us as it relates to food. How can we continue to get a large amount of food produced without the use of the glyphosates and the chemicals that are getting a lot of bad rap? Now, we spoke about judicious use of these things, that's one thing, but they're also developing new type of pesticides, like we say biorationals, meaning, as you made the example, Lesroy, extract from plants. Neem is a good extract. Neem in a good enough concentration, once worms feed on it, then they will stop reproducing, and they would also stop feeding. It affects their nervous system, so they become incoherent, and they also lose their appetite, so that they will basically starve. So there is neem. Some people use garlic. You know, there is hot pepper and things like that, right, which can be used. Also, there are microorganisms, bacteria, fungus in the food chain that can feed on. For example, again, you can take caterpillars, and you can, if you were able to use a formulation which you call BT, right? It comes in different names, but it's really a bacteria, Bacillus thuringiensis. Once those spores get onto the insects, they will grow and grow into the body of the insect and eventually cause it to explode, right? So some of these things are slow, but they're out there. Another thing that can happen, a lot of beetles, there are certain beetles that feed on other insects. They're beetles, they're wasps, they're bacteria, they're fungus, and some countries are doing a lot of research on those things. In fact, let me just give two quick examples here in St. Kitts. I spoke to, it was Mr. Martin and Mr. Willie Dorr, some of the very early workers in agriculture. And there was a time here in St. Kitts where we had a moth that was eating down the cactus. And Mr. Martin told me that he was the one who received the biological control agent that he dispersed here in St. Kitts and also over in Nevis. And the US has a great example where they had a soft white and red insect, they call it cotton cushion scale, that was just feeding down a lot of their crops. And they went to Australia and they got a beetle that they now feeds on the scale and released the beetle, and they were good feeding of it. We've done it here in St. Kitts as well in trying to control the worms in mangoes and also in trying to control certain other insects. So chemicals is one, but there are other options. Here are two emerging, well, one is more emerging than the other. Here are two other options that I want us to consider. There is, and I'm not advocating, but there is the GMO concept. The use of GMOs was basically designed to reduce the use of chemicals. That is a controversial thing. It seemed to me from my literature review that it has worked reasonably well in terms of the reduction of insect pests. But where it came to reducing the effects of the weed population, that one is said to have not as good as effect. But generally, there's still a lot of discussions about whether people should use GMOs and whether GMO is causing weeds to be resistant to chemicals and you're producing new, giant, terrible insects. But that aside, GMO is an alternative to some of the conventional pesticides. Finally, one of the more recent things which we may be less familiar with is a concept called cell-cultured meats, simply meaning making food in the lab. And the other 5 years ago, it sounded novel, where you could take a test tube and you could generate meat or fruits and vegetables. And it sounded very much in the research stage. But I'll read a paragraph here for you. It says that, I just pulled the wrong page, so just a few seconds. Singapore Food Agency has approved cell-cultured chicken. And what is that? It makes the country the first in the world to give its so-called its go-ahead to selling meat that was created in the lab. Cultured meat is made by putting stem cells from the fat or the muscles of an animal into a cultural medium that feed the cells, allows them to grow and proliferate. So maybe eventually there will be less need or no need at all for these pesticides because our foods will be coming from the lab. Finally, in the St. Kitts context, neither GMOs nor lab-cultured food is our solution. We here produce about 10% or less of what we eat. We need to produce a lot more of our own food. Yes, we don't want to depend so heavily on pesticides. Maybe we'd look at the biorationals, maybe we would look at the biocontrol agents, but we still need to be able to generate a lot more because we don't want the concept of, well, not using chemicals because we're not producing food. We have to produce food, we have to be healthy, but yes, also be cognizant and to keep down those heavy, deleterious chemicals because you don't want eating on the one hand, hoping to be healthy, and then ingesting a chemical that gives you cancer. The net effect is that it's no better. So we have to find that balance, but certainly we need to address the idea of our food security.
Yes, and that debate rages on in terms of we're hearing now about organic foods and non-organic. We are now hearing in terms of more modern methods of farming where you don't use the soil, you're using hydroponics and things like that, and trying to see if that, is going to have less pests and all of that sort of thing. But nonetheless, the bottom line is that of food safety and looking in terms of what we are consuming and how that can impact our health.
If you
sure.
let me to just add something to what Mr. James is saying here in terms of alternatives, I will like to go back on a little history because I think that if we used to listen to our forefathers and so on, they will tell you that in their heyday they never used to use all of those things. Because what they used to practice is something that is now coming back on stream. It's called companion planting. If you look into some old person's yard who doing farming, you'll find all kind of foods mixed together. Because there and then they have foods that repels certain insects. You plant thyme among cabbages, carrots, and so on. Those things there have a repelling effect on certain insects. And once that is done, once you plant those things in close proximity to each other, they tend to repel pests that affects another food source. In browsing, came across one here that the United Kingdom is now practicing what Mr. James talking about. It's called natural barriers, and they actually call it beetle banks, where they leave a strip of land just solely for beetles to proliferate right there. And those beetles, as Mr. James pointed out, eat quite a bit of insects. So here it is that they're now rebuilding back nature by having these beetle banks that will encourage the natural proliferation of beetles that will serve as a natural pesticide, predatory insects. So these are the kind of things that we can practice to reduce our dependency on harmful pesticides. Again, he did mention the use of plant-based chemicals, and that is something that a lot of persons are now turning to help to reduce the harmful effects of pesticides. So these alternatives, and as the theme say, we are trying to look for a better life. Some of these botanicals you can spread them now, and maybe 10, 15, 20 minutes after, because they're plant-based, you can go back and you can use them. The other chemicals, you have to wait 7 or 2 weeks before you can harvest and eat them. So it is important that to protect our health, that once a chemical is being used, that you read the label very, very carefully, because some will tell you when you can return into the land, when you can eat those foods. So it's very important that all of these things is done, and that is what the label is for. Some of us, we don't read the label. You just, it kills that and you spray. So it's important that for our farmers that they read the label and follow the labeled instructions.
Yes.
And as I said, for the alternatives, we mentioned biocontrol, companion planting, the use of predatory insects and so on. Those are some of the alternatives that we can mention in the sugar industry. Back to where Mr. Willie Do and so on. I remember when Smut was in, it was the same thing. Insects were brought in to help control those things within the sugar industry. And they're allowed to proliferate, but because of our judicious use of the pesticides right now, most of those beneficial insects that you had mentioned earlier on, we can't find them anymore because we kill them out.
Jack Spaniards, we don't see them anymore.
So it's important that we understand that balance, we use pesticides, but we do not target the pest that we are looking for.
Yes.
We just do it. So we need to know, once you're using it, you have to know the specific pest that you are targeting when you're utilizing these pesticides.
Good. Now, at one time they even spoke about bringing in certain types of mosquitoes to get rid of other mosquitoes and all of that. You heard that sort of a talk. But we have to go to the phone lines and to see if we have anybody there listening and who are interested in asking a question or making some sort of a comment or giving a suggestion. The numbers to call are 466-2666. That's 466-2666, 662-8674, 662-8674, 767-4765, 767-4765, and the overseas number is 1-239-645-4500. 1 4500. We await your calls. Right. Now, Mr. Williams, one of the functions that was mentioned of the Pesticides and Toxic Chemicals Control Board is to register pesticide products for use here in the Federation. What is the process for doing this?
Good time. Yeah, that's correct. That is one of the mandate of the Pesticides Board, and that's a very critical one. We have in place a technical review committee that actually receives and look at applications for pesticides product registration. We have a comprehensive process. One, it looks at the identity of the product, and they do have products with different brand names, but very, very similar. The physical and chemical properties of the product, because we need to know what family it belongs to and whether there are issues with some of these chemicals, as you're aware of. The details of the use and further information on the product. We want to know what it is, what it was it produced for in terms of its use, what pest it's going to target, or whether it's weeds, herbicides, insecticides, fungicides, etc. They're all different varieties of pesticides. So we need to know all that information. And I must say, though, we do have an application form which must be filled out completely, giving all the details that are required. Classification of the pesticide, whether it's a highly hazardous product, moderate or minimum risk pesticide. The labeling is also important. It must be packaged and labeled properly. Label must have on, as Mr. Ambrose indicating, details in terms of whether you need to wear protective equipment, the directions for use, so as to eliminate or reduce any risk or exposure to the user. We need also the methods of analysis. We need to be able to analyze the product. So the manufacturer must produce the information in terms of how you analyze the product for us to determine whether it contains the correct concentration. If it says it's a 50% active ingredient, we need to check to see whether it is 50%. In most cases, the inactive ingredient is not declared. I think that is probably changing because we're now realizing in some cases the inactive ingredient can be dangerous also. So that is slightly changing. The impact on human health. We need to know all that information. Residues, fate and behavior in the environment. And this is where the scientific review comes critical. We have access, as I mentioned earlier, we have access to scientific review on all these products. As a matter of fact, a product would probably not get anywhere if the scientific review wasn't done. So there are information coming from the JMPR, which is it's a committee made up of experts from around the world, and it's really JMPR meaning Joint Meeting Pesticides Residue. So they examine all the information on pesticides residue in terms of what are the maximum levels of residue that are allowed in food. Effects on non-target species, and you heard Mr. James mention that. Sometimes we spray a product and it reduces, or in some cases eliminate some essential organisms. For instance, bees, the birds are affected. So we need to have all that information. If the product is going to be harmful to bees, most likely we would not bring a product like that into St. Kitts. efficacy, whether the product is doing what it is designed to do. We need to determine all of that. And then we need to make an overall conclusion after evaluating the product based on these. It's not limited to this. There are other issues that we may want to look at. But we need to be clear and sure that this product is safe for use in St. Kitts and Nevis.
Right. So we have to ensure that the pesticide products that we are registering here in St. Kitts and Nevis, that they are the safest for use among the population, and that they minimize the risk to the environment and to human health. So you have a serious responsibility. And in the case of, I mentioned before, and I go back to it, in those French territories, Guadeloupe and Martinique, if there was such a board, a pesticides control board, the question that I still have is then why was this chlordicone being allowed to be registered in the country at serious risk to human health? And that is the question.
Well, I don't have the specifics on that also, but it would be interesting to know how it got into the country, or that incident occurred before some of the, as I mentioned before, it's on a ban list presently. I'm not sure whether it happened before it got on the ban list, but sometimes, and maybe in a lot of cases, things only happen after the incident. Then it is raised at the right place and action taken. For instance, and I don't necessarily want to bring up the glyphosate issue, but that is also a problem, and there is mixed reviews on it. For instance, in the USA, the US EPA still have not banned glyphosate. It has been, well, for a better word, it has been labeled as non-carcinogenic. But in some other reviews, it is a probable cancer agent. And so in some cases, in some countries, it has actually been banned. But I would say globally, or in most countries, it's not.
Right.
It's not banned. But in St. Kitts and Nevis, I would say what we have done here, the product is in St. Kitts, we have put it on a restricted list, which means that it would not be allowed into St. Kitts unless we are satisfied that it is safe for use here.
Right. The French president, Emmanuel Macron, termed what happened in Guadeloupe and Martinique, because of course they're the departments of France.
Yes.
And he said that it's an environmental scandal and that France had suffered collective blindness over the issue. So it had reached to such proportions that people have been affected by the use of this pesticide, that people in Guadeloupe and Martinique, it is ever foremost in their minds in terms of what has really happened.
No.
A chemical, a pesticide that they did not produce, that was brought in for use on the banana plantation. Now, Mr. James, what are some of the human health impacts of pesticides? I know that we've been discussing, but what are some of them? Any one of you? Cancer is not the only one.
No, in fact, in the beginning, Mr. Amory made mention of some examples, and I'll make some comments, and I'll ask him to just remind the listeners of what the specifics are. But first, you can have acute symptoms, meaning that very obvious, vomiting and those kind of things, which is severe poisoning, severe impacting on you. That is like if somebody ingests or maybe inhale a lot of the products, right? Of course, sometimes somebody can be rendered unconscious. For example, if you walk into a room where a lot of the pesticides were stored in bad condition, then you could have what you call volatilization, meaning the active ingredient has come out of being in solution, and it's as a
Air
vapor.
quality has been affected.
Yeah, it's a vapor in the air. And you go in there, you inhale too much of it, you get the impacts. Whether it's going to cause you to vomit, runny nose, eyes
Burning.
affected, that kind of thing. That's where you have acute symptoms, right? But then there's the case now where we spoke about bioaccumulation, meaning that you get very small quantities in your system over time. Now here's what happens, right? In truth and in fact, even when we eat the food after the safe period, Mr. Amory said that you use a chemical, you check the labels, they might say to you, if you use the chemical today, 2 days after you can eat the food. What really happens is that it is not always a case that there is no pesticide, It's a case that the level is so low, it is unlikely to harm you. So you're eating it, and you're ingesting a small amount of the pesticide. But if we keep doing a lot of that, all these small amounts eventually add up to a significant amount. And then there is where the long-term things come in, like we would mention, the cancers and that kind of thing. So these are some. You have immediate effects and you have long-term effects. Mr. Amory had run through a whole list, and Mr. Amory, I don't know if you care to just remind
just
us.
to add, but Mr. Williams have been alluding to them all along because he's talking
so some
about
of the
birth defects,
Birth defects and all
birth
that.
defects,
infertility and so on, because
brain development.
brain development
Right.
diseases, eye problems and so on. I just before
respiratory
problems and so on.
illnesses.
Right.
Just before we start this program,
And one thing we didn't mention, death.
death. Thank you. that is
I guess
so
we're
true.
just very
Because
modest.
they can be very fatal.
I guess we're very modest to ourselves.
Yes.
But we've had deaths here in St. Kitts.
Yeah,
At least two
because-
deaths. A
Yes.
child, forgive me for interrupting you.
No
A
problem.
child accidentally ate some rat poison. I don't know if you remember, but there was a rat poison that looks exactly like
candy.
sugar.
Yeah.
Yeah, a child ingested that and died. And then, of course, I mentioned earlier of the Gramoxone situation.
You know, I'm happy that you mentioned that because it raises the whole question of storage and disposal of pesticides. And additionally, what Mr. Amy was saying before in terms of, you have to store them in a very safe place, because then if children get access to pesticides and, these toxic chemicals, it can be deadly for them. When I studied in Trinidad a few years ago, there was a common occurrence taking place there, the Gramoxone, and they used to call it the Indian tonic.
Unfortunately.
Because what would happen, unfortunately, it's
The
not
Southern
a
Caribbean,
nice
yes,
thing,
yes.
but people would
Misuse.
ingest the Gramoxone
Yeah.
to kill themselves.
Yes.
In fact, there was one guy who used to read news when I was in Trinidad, and he was a news reporter, and he thought it best, because of some relationship issues, to go and ingest
The Indian tonic.
the Indian tonic and ended up, in a very
Peaceful.
very peaceful. But before that, they tried all kinds of things. It is then I discovered that, you know, charcoal can be given to people and so on to sort of rid them of
Yeah.
toxins
Neutralize it, yeah.
and so on.
Bring back up. Yeah.
Yes, but that is if it's done as soon as possible.
As soon as yes.
One of the other things
It's
too
out
is
the
one
system.
other antidote is you can use muddy water because it helps
Soil.
to these things, as you asked the question earlier about the breakdown in the soil, and some chemicals that deactivated quite quickly in the soil. Gramoxone is one that it doesn't stay too long in the soil, so that is when they say, okay, you can drink muddy water and anything. But take, for instance, other chemicals now they're in the soil for quite some time. So it's very important that, you know, one know this. Talking about these health issues and the storage, I know a couple of years back, Mr. James mentioned that looking like candy. The M&Ms, that's the word I was looking for. There was
Chocolate, yeah.
There was a rat poison actually that looked like M&Ms, very small. I think, I do believe I've seen some of them still on the shelves. And, you know, carelessly, person just buy one and just sit down, see it, a child, oh, it's candy, bap, eat. That's it. You know, so it's very important that householders recognize that these things are dangerous and they should not even be stored in the house. We cannot stress too much on that importance of keeping them out. And the label strictly say, keep out of the reach of children, because they do not know the dangers. And some of them, especially aerosols, I know you see the TVs are about and see somebody spray and light a match in front of one. I've seen that done. The child just with a match and have a flamethrower. These are things that we have to be careful. Next thing you know, the house is on fire. So the storage of chemicals is very important. They should not be stored in the house. But if those household chemicals that are deemed safe should be stored out of the reach of children. And I think that is very important that Mr. James mentioned the mosquito coils. When they had these black mosquito coils, and when we do our research, we found it was carcinogenic. Persons light a mosquito coil, they go to sleep. Do not know we are inhaling that all the time.
We have some now, I mean, you were speaking about them, the color being black. We have some now that they're green. You know the green ones, you put them on the thing, you light them, and you're smoking all night,
Right.
basically. Are those harmful to persons?
Well, we try.
Most
yes.
of them are not. But when we look at, there have been some that have been red flag. So we have a list of that, and that's what we would look at. But particularly the black mosquito coil, that has been a problem, and we have banned the import of that into St. Kitts and Nevis. But those that are safe for use, have already gone through the analysis, etc., we would allow them into St. Kitts. But there's a list so we can identify which are safe for use in St. Kitts. But to add also to the storage, there are pest operators in St. Kitts who have a certain amount of products that they need to store. So it's also important that they are aware that there are procedures or methods that are best for controlling or for storing these pesticides. They have to be careful in terms of not storing them inside a family home, inside a residential area. They must be stored in areas where they should be at least 100 feet from residential areas.
And away from flammable, from
Yes.
yeah.
That's correct.
A lot of them would burn.
And
They would
stored,
burn.
yes, and stored properly in properly ventilated
Properly ventilated.
yes,
area.
And the
storage
right
areas.
containers.
And ensure that the flooring is such that if you have a spill, it can be easily cleaned or drained off. not seep into any board or into soil where you can have a contaminated area. So those things are important and critical in terms of storage also.
What about the disposal, Mr. Williams? We're talking about the storage, but if you have to dispose of pesticides, what are some of the areas of concern there? And what is some advice that you can actually give to farmers with respect to the disposal of pesticides?
Also, that is also critical, but I'll let Mr. James speak to it, because we did have a project in place recently whereby we accumulated a lot of the obsolete pesticides and actually got them exported. But Mr. James can give further information on that because he was the lead in that project also.
Thanks. Disposal in St. Kitts is a very ticklish thing. The truth is that these chemicals should not form a part of a regular garbage system, right? In fact, we do not have any facilities to adequately neutralize or dispose of these kind of substances. First thing, if you are an operator, you should try to import a quantity that you can use all of it, yet without misusing it. You're not going to use it up just because you want to get rid of it. But you have to be so careful that the quantity you use, you can use all of it, so that the environment is the one that would be responsible for the final disposal. If you have excess and you have things which are old and obsolete, then right now the best you can do is keep them stored in a container that is not going to leak. Maybe like a good thick rubber container. Because in truth and in fact, those substances would need to be neutralized either by microbial activity, or you take them to a specialized factory where they could be incinerated and rendered harmless. We don't have any of those things nearby here in the Eastern Caribbean. Some people have their chemicals held in drums, like SSMC had some for years, and that was a good idea. It's better than taking them down to the landfill and dumping them. It's better than burying them. It's better than taking them out to sea. None of those things should be an option. Fortunately for us in St. Kitts, there was a OECS, in fact, there's a more like a CARICOM project to get rid of unused and unwanted toxic substances. And those things were collected and they were shipped. We had to send them all the way to England to be incinerated. Barbados have a facility where they could take things like aerosol cans and recycle them. So that can happen. What we encourage the farmers to do is that when you use a container, don't dump it. When it's empty, rinse it out. Not once, not twice, rinse it 3 times. At the end of that, it should be relatively free of the residues. And then the other thing they should do is just hold it in a safe place. There was a time that the Department of Agriculture went around and collected these containers. Ideally, we should maybe like have them stored in such a way that eventually they could be sent to the right factory, that you could maybe like recycle them, make them into a new kind of plastic. But you certainly have a task in our hand because we don't have a lot of facilities around here to handle them. So for now, they really should be held in a safe place. Unfortunately, I can't tell you which ministry. I don't think, again, we've gotten to this stage to say it's the Ministry of Environment that is responsible for that, or Agriculture, or the Pesticide Board. I think that's still a gray area, but somehow they should be stored, and then periodically, maybe there might be a national program of collecting, shipping, and neutralizing. Mm-hmm. So that one is something that we need to look into, to have it kind of centralized, that there'll be a body responsible for the safe disposal of these very dangerous things. We don't want them in the soil, we don't want them in the ocean, we don't want them in the landfill.
Just to add to what Mr. James said, with the rinsing, the triple rinsing, what should be what was a little omitted there was that once you rinse, you just don't rinse and throw it on the ground. You rinse it into your knapsack sprayer.
Yeah.
So that is very important. You don't rinse it because you will rinse and just dump on the ground. You rinse it back into your knapsack. So you leave, once it's finished, then you leave that space so that once you rinse, you can pour it into your knapsack. Very important not to rinse it and throw it on the ground.
And it's very important for our farmers to have all of this information. Now, is there anything done? Not everybody might be listening to this program, farmers, but what is being done to help to develop an awareness in terms of, among our farmers, in particular, in terms of the hazardous effects of chemicals, storage, disposal, and all of that?
Well, I can speak from being a former director of agriculture in Nevis point of view. Over the years, what we normally try to do is to get the different agencies to come in and give a talk about these hazardous problems. The pesticide week is one such, another avenue that is utilized, that you let people know what is going on. The open day affair, where you have the extension officers have their booth, and that is one of the things that is put forward, and I do believe is the same thing that Mr. James, as a director, could tell you is the same thing. Over the years, we always try to bring that to the fore, the dangers. The IECA, ROC, and all of them, we get FAO, we get posters from them, and we put them up. Anytime Mr. Williams go, the Stockholm Convention or the Rotterdam Convention, the Basel Convention, and those information is brought back, we try as much to disseminate them, put them up in the agriculture department and give to farmers, So we do try,
yes,
but sometimes, the rate all in terms of dollars and cents, sometimes to do these kind of things, programs is a challenge.
Yeah.
But it's very important, and I'm very thankful for, we being here on this program, because I think we have hopefully reached a very, very wide audience who will now understand the very importance of this thing. And I know we might be wrapping up soon, so I will really like to get in something here that
certainly. Go ahead.
It's very, very important that farmers or household owners recognize the fact that pesticides basically are restricted goods coming into the country. And before they order or even pack a barrel, as one says, coming on to Christmas and everybody may want a small bottle of Gramaxone, couple box or whatever it is, come into the barrel. It's very important that they inform their family, listen, I'm putting in such and such a thing into your barrel. Could you kindly go to the Department of Agriculture, both in St. Kitts or Nevis, and to verify if it's registered to come into the country. And in addition to that, do you have a license so that you can clear it? So it's very important that they are aware that there's this procedure. If you are in doubt, kindly contact the various departments of agriculture to find out what are the procedures in terms of getting these chemicals in.
Right, and as you said, Mr. Amory, we're basically out of time. I would ask Mr. Williams and Mr. James to give the audience their parting words on a topic that is so important, especially as we are, this week is Pesticides Awareness Week. And did you say that there were some activities, but they were curtailed because of the COVID? Did you say that in the beginning?
Yes, correct. Normally around this time we have a whole week of activities. As Mr. Amri mentioned also, one of the activities would have been to have a workshop with the farmers where we get representatives from the suppliers who would come in and speak to farmers about the safe use of their products. And in addition to that, we run out of workshop, we have a fair, etc. But unfortunately, as I said, so we're happy to be here today, and we hope that the audience would have had a fair understanding of the pesticides, their use, the dangers of their use, etc. And also the farmers to be careful to make sure that they read the labels, because this is also critical. They have to read the labels, because if they're not reading the labels, they may not use the product as directed.
And if you can't read, you get somebody to read it for you.
Well,
you know?
Which could cause exposure to the pesticides in a way that would be damaging to your health and also to the environment. So thanks again, and I hope that we have been helpful in providing the type of information that's needed to be out there in the public.
Mr. James?
In the St. Kitts context, I see pesticides as a necessary evil. I do not anticipate that in the very near future we could be totally off the use. But it is very necessary for us to follow the instructions for safe use, for us to be judicious and diligent, because one of the things we use them for, as we say, is in public health, in the household, and in agriculture. Three very critical areas for our health and our well-being. As it relates to farming, while we say that we are low pesticide users, there's still room for changes, for looking at things like integrated pest management, for looking at things like, as Ms. mentioned earlier, use of companion crops, trap crops, cultural measures, reduce tillage, many other methods that can help us to keep our production high and greater, yes, less dependence on harmful and harsh chemicals. We, as a people, need to engage each other, the farmers, the purchasers, and the department and the pesticide board, so that together we will be able to produce and be healthy. After all, for us to be wealthy, we must be healthy. It ought to be our aim, and I want to thank us for spending the afternoon, and I trust that we would have benefited, and that here, going forward, we would be a better country because of the information we had. Thank you for being with us.
Well, thank you, Mr. James, and of course, for all three of you for coming and sharing on how we can reduce our reliance on pesticides and basically select pesticides with the lowest risk. That is, some of the qualities of them being biodegradable and friendly towards our environment. We have to think in terms of the sustainable planet, sustainability, which is very important, sustainable agriculture, sustainable farming, and things like that. And we'll get there in terms of the alternatives eventually, because then we're thinking in terms of a better world, in terms of human beings striving in the best of health and the environment being in the best of health. So thank you very much, Mr. James, Mr. Williams, and Mr. Amri. Thank you so much for being here today and sharing on such an important area, that of pesticides control. It is not very often. I think it's the first time I've had you on this program, and I found it to be rather interesting. I learned quite a bit myself. I did a little bit of reading and research before I came to the program. So I am able to at least engage you
Thank you.
on
Thank you.
such
Thank
an important topic.
Thank you
So
very much indeed.
thank you. It has been a pleasure. Thank you very much to all of you who listened to our Working for You program today. Next week, we will be back with another Working for You program. Until then, take good care. I am Les Roy Williams.